Welcome EPQ students, and congratulations for getting to the mid-project review stage of the project. It's time for us to decide the final title and really plan how you're going to go about writing your report or finishing your artifact or writing your report for your artifact. Those students who get this far almost always go on to do very well in desk. So as I say, you should pat yourself on the back for getting this far. Now, the next stage I like to call the supreme ordeal. And if we think about the EPQ as a hero's journey, you've completed the initial ideas, you've gone through the first threshold of refining your titles, you've got into the second threshold where you've done all of your research, and now it's time for what we call the supreme ordeal, when you write the report itself. So, filling in the project queue isn't always the most exciting thing. Try to think of it then in these terms, and hopefully you'll be a little bit more entertained. What are we covering today? We're looking at an overview of the contents of the mid-project review. We're looking at the assessment criteria and how to use the production log to earn marks all of the time. We're going to be highlighting problem solving and decision making, and relating that again to the assessment criteria. We're going to be making sure that you have evidence of planning. We're going to be talking about speaking to the coordinator and the examiner through your production log. We're going to be looking at some exemplar material from desk students. And then we're going to finish by talking about moving on to the draft and some general advice. So first of all, is this the beginning of the end or the end of the beginning? Well, I would say now we're into the final phase of the project, the second half of the project, because the next time that you fill in the production log on Project Q will be the project product review, and you fill this in only after you've completed your first draft. So an enormous amount is going to happen now between the mid-project review and the project product review when you actually write the dissertation, the report. So what are we going to be covering in the mid-project review? We need to decide and review, look at and reflect upon what we've achieved thus far. So the best thing to do before you write the mid-project review would be to look back at the planning review. This is when you decided your course of action. And you need to identify successes, but also you need to identify obstacles you face, and you need to evidence how you overcame these. If, for instance, you were relying on doing a sample with students recently and COVID-19 has come up, then you need to talk about how difficult that's been and how you're not going to be able to do the project you initially wanted. Now, you could highlight your self-pity, but it would be a lot more positive to highlight how are you going to get around this. Now, I've spoken to quite a few of you recently, and you are in this predicament. We've had this bizarre disruptive force that's changed all of our plans. Now's the time to show resilience, problem solving, and decision making, and to talk about these things in your production log, okay? Have you decided to keep the same title? Well, this is going to be a really, really important one, because in this mid-project review, you will decide your final title, and it really does need to be your final title. And then you've got to think really about a kind of a plan for drafting it. And after you've completed the mid-project review, you will launch yourself into producing the written report, okay? So what are the essential things to think about? The product project review will be completed only with the first draft. So in the meantime, we need to get that draft written. So in this entry is the key as you will now begin to develop your written report, okay? Some of you have already started it, etc. But the main point now is that you've finished most of the research. You might need to do a little bit more, but you've done most of the reading, the majority of the reading, the majority of the research, and you will now produce a detailed plan. Another thing that I would like you to do, and that will earn you further marks, is to discuss your Gantt chart or your timetable and the adaptations that you've made to it. As I'm going to show you in a minute later in the screencast, you might want to produce a whole new Gantt chart or timetable, particularly in light of COVID-19, which has disrupted all of our lives. Yeah. And if you have changed or refocused the title, why and how, explain this in detail to me, the coordinator, and to the examiner. And most of all, be absolutely honest about the problems that you faced. This is an opportunity to gain marks. And I think in education today, so often we're frightened and we avoid talking about failure and difficulty and obstacles. Now's the time to highlight it and to show learning and meta skills. So which are the boxes to fill in your production log? The questions that you're going to be looking at is my project following the original plan? How's my plan developed? Now, for almost everyone, it's very unlikely that your project has followed the plan completely. If you're one of those extraordinarily lucky people, then you can actually say that. But for most of us, we'll have tinkered with it and we've made some differences, etc. Don't only record these changes, explain them. That's the key thing. The next box after that is the summary of comments and advice from my supervisor. So it's absolutely essential that now you contact your supervisor and you should record the discussion that you have with them. If it's in the form of an email, you could even produce some quotations from that email. If it's a WebEx style conversation, make sure that you take very careful notes or record the screen. And the next box then will be this one, the key one, where the modifications are recorded. And here the examiner is looking for evidence of what we call dialogic learning, where there's a to and fro between you and your supervisor. So it's absolutely key that you make these discussions fruitful and productive. Then we get to the hugely important stage of the final title. And you will end by my plan next steps to complete the project. So this is a very important entry in terms of the production log, and it's one that I know that the EPQ markers often look at in a lot of detail. Now, in terms of the writing and reading stage, the research and reading stage is now coming to an end. And in particular, if you look at the EPQ textbook, it says now you finish your research, you have to start the writing. I'm going to disagree with that slightly. And I'm going to say, when I'm writing myself, when I've studied for my higher degrees, I tend to find that I've done a lot of reading and research, then I do some writing. But actually, when I've done some of the writing, I might find some gaps in my knowledge, and I might have to return to the reading stage before I do a little bit more writing. So I think you should think about this diagram more than that one. As you're drafting now, there might be times when you need to refer to articles and journals where you see some gaps in your knowledge. So don't be afraid to do that. In fact, that's good academic practice. Now I'm going to return to the assessment criteria and remind you of how to use the production log to earn marks. Okay. Under A01, we have to identify the topic being investigated, and that's going to be very important today because you're giving your final title. You're showing evidence of appropriate aims and objectives. So it's absolutely key in your planning today that you have clear aims and objectives. We want a detailed project plan. So make sure that you now go return and revisit that plan that you initially launched last time. And now you're going to reevaluate it. And that's something that you can produce. I want to remind you that in the production log, it's perfectly acceptable to put some tables and dates, etc. in. In fact, I think it's very desirable. Now, in terms of A03, which is the most important assessment criteria in the EPQ, the develop and realize, now it's time to show that appropriate data is collected and thoroughly analyzed. And this is a key one. Any changes to the agreed plan are explained. So remember, that's what the production log is for you evidencing and giving an account of your decisions and where there are changes, etc. And now, finally, the reflection and review criteria of A04, assessment objective number 4, evaluation of the candidate's own learning during the project, I beg your pardon. It's key now that you actually reflect on your learning, you show evidence that you've acquired some new skills, and if possible, you will discuss and be self-critical and say, this is what I've learned from this, now I won't do that anymore, I'm going to avoid this, and I'm going to avoid it by using the following methods. So again, the production log is the place to discuss these things, okay? Now, one thing that is very painful for us is at this particular time now, you have to discuss material you'll not use. I've done this a great deal in my research. I've done all sorts of reading, etc. And then I've realized it doesn't really fit in. And then you think, what about all this labor I've wasted? I can't give this stuff up. I'm going to put it in the essay even though it doesn't fit. Please don't. It isn't wasted. Yes, it's disappointing, but it's an opportunity to show learning in your production log. So one of the things that you can do is to say, well, my primary research didn't actually work out, unfortunately. I've decided to abandon this and discuss it, because then the examiner becomes aware of that invisible work. So remember what I've said before. The production log is to make the invisible visible. It's your job to show the background story that is often missing from the actual artifact or report that is written in the end. Now I'm going to set you a little exercise, okay? These are 5 different students. Each of them has a problem. At the end of the slide, I want you to pause the slide and I want you to think how these students could solve their problems. Firstly, we have John. I want to look at the criminal justice system in Europe, but found that this was too overwhelming. Well, there's no surprise there that he found that overwhelming. So as I say, please come up with a solution to help John there. Ahmed says, I was worried about reaching the word limit. So he's got a different concern. What kind of advice can you think of giving Ahmed? How could he solve that problem? Zina says, I am very concerned that I will exceed the word limit. So she's the opposite of Ahmed. Can you please think of a way that Zina could strategize to overcome this difficulty that she's facing? Jasmine says, I wanted to interview a local politician about recycling, but he did not respond to my emails. So how can Jasmine get over this obstacle that she faces? And finally, number 5, Paul says there's not enough information on the use of nanotechnology in the treatment of melanoma. What's poor old Paul going to do? Is he going to give up the EPQ, or can you think of a way around that? So I'm pausing the screen myself. I want you to do the same. Now you've had a little bit of time to think about these 5 different students' difficulties, and I'm going to go through them and I'm going to group them together. First of all, John says he wanted to look at the criminal justice system in Europe, but found this was too overwhelming. Well, to be honest with you, I think his supervisor and his coordinator should have told him that this was inevitably going to be the case when he did the candidate proposal. There's no way that 5,000 words can look at criminal justice systems across Europe. So he's going to need to focus this title on a particular country, perhaps, or on a particular item of legislation or a particular aspect of the criminal justice system. No wonder poor old John found this overwhelming. Ahmed, on the other hand, is very worried about reaching the word limit. Now, it seems to me quite clearly Ahmed has chosen something that is perhaps too specific, or he hasn't done enough reading. So again, that would be something to discuss with his supervisor. Should he refocus and change the title, or should he be reading more? Has he got the possibility of, say, doing some primary research? It's not too late at this particular time. Zine, on the other hand, is very worried about exceeding the word limit. That's something that a lot of students do, and you do lose marks for it in A01 if the dissertation or the report is too long. So it'd be a good idea for Zina to narrow and refocus her report. Jasmine says that she wanted to interview a local politician about recycling, but he did not respond to her emails. But that's often going to be the case, as we know. We write to experts all of the time, and most of the time it's a frustrating business. When it works, it can be incredibly fruitful, And it's a wonderful thing to strike up a conversation with a world expert in a particular subject. But in Jasmine's case, she's simply going to have to do without that and find other sources of information, perhaps from people who run recycling plants, etc. There are many options available to her, and she could discuss this in her production log. Paul says there's not enough information on the use of nanotechnology in the treatment of melanoma. Well, perhaps I'm not surprised, Paul, you've chosen such a specific field. It's revolutionary, it's emerging. You may need to change your title to widen and expand it so that you're looking at the use of nanotechnology in medicine more generally. I'm not an expert in biology, but it would be a good idea perhaps to go and speak to a biologist or someone in a medical related field. And now we're going to look at a few examples from students who filled out the mid-project review in recent years. Here's a particular excellent project that concerned childhood trauma and its links to adult autoimmune syndrome. And we're going to look at the first box, and this is where she's talked about how far has it followed her original plan. And this student says, I have now read all of my research articles and I'm working on taking notes on each one to figure out where they best fit into the structure of my essay. So this shows clear evidence that she's planning the structure of her essay. The research I've evaluated has been very wide as there are many different studies investigating different kinds of chronic illnesses. I realize that chronic illnesses has too much research and different explanations for me to be able to include in the 5,000-word report. Hence, my title is now The Relations Between Child Trauma and Adult Autoimmune Disease. So intelligent discussion there of why there is a change in her title. I decided to focus on adult immune disease since the impact of overstimulation of HPA axis has direct effects on the immune system's cortisol levels. So I'm not going to read the rest of it. I'm going to allow you to pause the slide and look at it. But you will see that this student carefully explains to the reader the reasons behind all of her changes. And it really uses excellent specialist terminology, etc. And it also discusses the actual wording of the title itself. And I'm just going to look at the final paragraph here, because I think this is particularly good. After completing all the changes to my essay title, I focused on structuring my essay, moving areas around and prioritizing the importance of certain sections. I have now decided upon each of the subheadings of my essay. So you can see why I've chosen this as an example for you, because the student shows evidence of very careful planning of the report structure, and she reflects on her earlier plan and shows why there has been these adaptations and changes to the plan. So excellent use of the production log, and as you can see from the annotations along the side, that allows us to give her a far more marks, and she in particular is scoring very highly in terms of A03, the develop and realize. Now, in terms of the advice, I want to remind you I use the term dialogic learning from Vygotsky, from the Russian psychologist Vygotsky, who believed that learning takes place when people discuss things and talk to one another. And in project-based learning, this is often the case. Here, the student says, after my discussion with my supervisor, we came to the conclusion that I'm making consistent progress involving delving further into my research. She agreed with my change of title. Therefore, we had a productive discussion regarding the review with similar comments about the categorization of sources and research that's ongoing. She might have had a couple of examples in there to improve this, but it clearly evidences the fact that the supervisor and student here are engaging in genuine and productive dialogue and learning. Now, evidencing progress. This is the modifications I've made as a result of my discussion. And again, it's very important that you show that you are moving on all the time. I've said to you before that I think it's key that you take good notes or you record your discussions with your supervisors to help you fill in the production log. Here the student says, Although I'm not fully comfortable with allocating word limits for each of my subheadings, I feel that this has potential to limit my expectations. I have created a general idea of how much information each section could consist of. So again, you feel as though this student is highly methodical. She's thought about her subheadings. Now she's deciding how many words can go into them. So this is good evidence of macro planning, isn't it? And as you know, you'll record your final title. This is absolutely key. I can't stress it enough, because you cannot go back from this title. If you do, then you will have to go all the way back to the candidate proposal and begin again. So we need to be very careful about this. As I say at the end of this presentation, you are welcome to contact me if you have reservations about this. The final thing that you'll record is the next steps that you make. The next steps are very important again, because here you're going to show that you've taken on board all the information, you've revisited your plan, and now you're planning all the way to the final presentation and handing in the project. And I would be absolutely honest and transparent at the moment, because we're going through this COVID pandemic. We can actually say that these dates are highly tentative, because we don't know. We have no crystal ball. We don't exactly know what's going to happen in the future, but that doesn't mean that we don't plan. We still need to have evidence of planning. So what should we include? We should definitely talk about the rescheduling. You can discuss the closure of school, the lack of EPQ lessons, etc. You should definitely revisit your Gantt chart or your timetable and show changes. You should discuss COVID-19 as a disruptive event and how you've managed to cope with it. This is an opportunity to show real resilience and real decision making. And you should most certainly highlight your problems and show constructive changes that you have made. I think it's a very good idea that you include a timetable. I know that this is sometimes hard to put into a project queue, but if you did a simple table formation and actually pasted it in, this is evidence of very clear planning. Right, I'm now going to move on to a second mid-project review example. This one is about personalized medicine and melanoma, skin cancer. And let's see what this student has done. For a start, for the entry of development of the plan, my original plan was to investigate how personalized medicine could be used in the prevention of the treatment of MS patients. However, during my research time, I had to do a presentation on personalized medicine as a whole to my school's MedSoc. In preparation for this, I found lots of practical information, such as the results from clinical trials of cancer patients, that I could use in my report. Therefore, I decided to stop researching MS and instead further investigate the different types of cancer to see what was the best and most interesting option as the focus for my project. Also, I spent some time with my biology teacher going through year 13 portion of the genetics topic of the course. I did this so I could gain an understanding of the scope of the A-level spec and therefore work out what I needed to research and learn on my own. It also allowed me to understand the basics of genetic markers and how cancer can be caused in the stages of cell replication. So I particularly like this one because it shows two main reasons for changes and a refocus. This is not a student who simply changed their mind whimsically. This is someone who's done some very valuable work and research and realized that she needs to shift her question. So the core question of investigating personalized medicine remained the same. It's just that she moved from MS, from multiple sclerosis, to wanting to look at melanoma. She had two reasons. One was her extracurricular activities, the MedSoc. The other one being what she discussed with her biology teacher. And here, I would like to stress, however, she did not duplicate syllabus material. Remember that that is a big no-no in the EPQ. She's extending her knowledge beyond that. So the idea came from the curriculum, but it extends well beyond that. Advice from my supervisor. My supervisor supported the idea of looking into cancer moving away from MS after I explained that personalized medicine is only really an idea in terms of MS patients. However, in the treatment of cancer patients, actual research is being done and theories are being tested. So she made sure that she had a proper research base before she made this decision. For this reason, my supervisor agreed with the decision to change the focus of my project to a disease or illness with more empirical research available. Although my supervisor did mention that cancer as a whole is too wide and therefore a specific type of cancer should be chosen. So once again, the impression you get from this entry is someone who has a productive and interesting dialogue with her supervisor. And that's why she's able to make these decisions in an informed, methodical and thoughtful manner. And the modifications, after my meeting with my supervisor, I decided to research the different types of cancer more appropriately. And from this process, you see, she decides to focus on melanoma because of the availability of resources on this particular cancer. So again, I get the impression here of a student who works systematically, who has an interesting relationship with her supervisor, who sees other teachers, including the biology teacher, who reads, who thinks before changing things. All of it ample evidence of two things: A01 planning and A03 develop and realize. And her final title would be, to what extent will personalized medicine revolutionize the healthcare industry in the prevention and treatment of melanoma? So it's an excellent title. Now, as I say here on my slide, I would very much like you, especially during this COVID period when I want to make sure that you get enough guidance, you to email me your final title. It's very important that this title is the title that you stick to, because once you finish the mid-project review and your supervisor has spoken to you about it, and your supervisor has locked the page, there's no going back. So it's important that we do this in a really thoughtful manner and that you don't live to regret it later. And here we see the student here. My next steps, I will look into melanoma as a whole, its different causes, etc., etc., etc. She's also going to go and do a internship in the NHS in the UK. So again, fantastic work showing how the EPQ is so relevant to her life, to her future ambitions and her plans. That is what A-star projects have in common. So make sure that you show this has great significance in your life and your learning. Now, today we went through the mid-project review, we went through the assessment criteria, we talked about highlighting your problem solving and your decision making, we talked about A01, making sure that you have ample evidence of planning, we talked about remaking your Gantt chart, looking back at your timetable, showing evidence that you are able to cope with changes. I would very much like to emphasize how important it is that you speak to me at this particular time if you have any difficulties. The exemplar material I think was very useful for you, and it gives you an idea of exactly how to go about filling in this entry. And now it's time for you to move on to your draft. And I want to conclude this screencast by emphasizing how important. Now to conclude, I'm going to go back to my somewhat lame analogy that you are the hero and that this journey is really entering the most difficult period for you. The planning stage and the actual writing will be showing the fruits of all of that research and reading that you've done. So you cannot skimp on this particular stage. And it's very important that the stages that you go through in your planning are also recorded in your production log. As I said during the screencast, I'm very much here to help. Get in touch with me and your supervisors if you need some advice along your way.